So I want to share with you just a few thoughts about this series, and in particular this text, as I think it relates to who we are as we live out our lives in story. But I want to open with just a short snippet of a story that I've told before in here, because I think it illustrates something that I want to mention in a minute. It's a story about my Uncle Mac. I've told you all many stories about my Uncle Mac over the year or so, and written about him in the blog post. So you might remember this time. It was the first job that I ever had that my uncle actually gave me, and it was completely unexpected how it came about. I had lost my temper at school. I was, I think, in the 5th grade, and typically to having, when I would lose my temper, I was a little bit out of control. And my mind, as imaginative as it was, went into considering options for how to express my frustration as I was walking home. It'd just been one of those Alexander no good, very bad days kind of thing. And it just got worse and worse and worse. And as I was going home, I began plotting out what I would destroy when I got back to the house. And as I walked into the house, of course, the first things that looked tempting were things like china or some of my grandmother's vases, and things that were obviously off limits, but I thought to myself that would allow a lot of cathartic release to break something of such value. At least I was wise enough to realize there'd be consequences. But still, my temper was ruling over my reason, and so I was looking for something, and as I made my way through the kitchen, I saw it through the back window out the kitchen, the thing that I could break that hardly anybody would notice, but it would allow me the full expression of my anger. There were these clay pots that were along one side of a wall that was at the back of the yard, and my mom would use those for planting on Saturdays. It was kind of her release. She had a little more of a practical release. When you're stressful, plant things. I thought to myself, I could break all of these pots and nobody would ever notice because they're hidden. And then as I got involved with the whole experience, I dove into it. I put my whole self into it imaginatively, and I began to line up the clay pots in descending order, thinking to myself that this would be kind of fun. I turned them upside down. And then I noticed that the bottoms of pots, I suppose you've noticed this before too, the bottoms of pots are thinner than the outer edge of the pots. I imagine for allowing the water to seep through and that sort of thing. And I thought to myself, if I could hit the bottom of the pot with a hammer in just such a way, I might be able to just knock the bottoms of the pot out and then turn them back over and nobody would notice. And they still function essentially like a pot, right? You just put them on something, you put your dirt in there, and nobody would really particularly notice that. And so I turned them over in descending order, and I went back into the kitchen where we keep some of our tools, and I grabbed up a hammer, went back outside, and proceeded into my new experiment. And I started with the largest pot, and I hit it just right that it knocked about 2/3 out, tapped it again, and it was perfect. It worked exactly as I thought. Go home, try it, you'll see this works. If you do it just right, you can knock the bottom out, the rest of the pot will stay there. The problem is that the pots got smaller, and I wasn't feeling the full expression of my cathartic desires, and so I hit them a little harder, and the whole pot began to fall apart. By the time I got to the smaller ones, I had abandoned the whole experiment and was just smashing them with delight. I was down to the very last one when I heard the door open outside the kitchen to the backyard and saw my Uncle Mac standing there. And the hammer was still midair, of course. And he said, "Tommy, what are you doing?" And I answered the same way that every kid would answer when confronted with such a question. Nothing. Nothing? What do you mean, what am I doing? Nothing? And then he said, "Why would you be doing that?" To which I responded with the second most frequent answer that teenagers would give, and that is, I don't know. I mean, isn't that the most obvious answer we give when we've done something that we knew we shouldn't have done? In a way, we don't really know. We do it anyway. I expected my uncle to come over, being sort of the father figure that he was in our family, and I expected him to just grab me by the arm, take me inside, lecture me first, and then to probably work with my mother to devise some kind of punishment that I would deserve for this. Instead, he walked over to me, looked me in the eye, I kind of backed away from him a little bit, and he said, "How would you like to get paid to destroy stuff?" Which I thought was a trick question. I said, "What?" He said, "How would you like a job where you can destroy things and I'll pay you for it?" And I said, what kind of job is that? And he told me the whole thing, and I thought, oh, that would be awesome. But then I kept thinking, this is a joke here. You're gonna get mad at me any minute. He didn't say anything about the pots. He took what was left of the pots. He had me go in, get a broom and a dustpan. He said, let's clean this up, and then I'll take you to your first day at work. So we did all of that, threw it in the trash can, didn't say another word, put the hammer back in the drawer, and he took me to the first day at my job, my first job. It was a laundromat. My uncle owned 2 laundromats. He had broken washing machines. All of them were broken, were always strapped down with a ribbon, that would just tell people not to use this one. My job was to go down between the washing machines, and the ones that were broken, I got to tear all the pieces off. So I literally went in behind and tore the hoses off and tore the belts off and the motors, and anything that was intact I would put in a box, and one of the boxes said useful, and then I would put other stuff that looked more destroyed in the other box which said less useful. But neither of them said like trash. He said, I'm going to use it all somewhere or another. And so that's what I did for the next several weeks. That was my first job, and it was really a great job. My uncle paid me like $1 an hour. At the end of working 5 weeks, he never had brought up the whole thing about the clay pots. My mother never knew about it. For years, my mother never knew about it, actually, not until I was married and told her about all the things I used to do. And isn't that when you normally tell your mom, right? You don't know what I was doing. And but at the end of those 4 or 5 weeks that I was working, as we were driving home one day, and he said, "So you've earned a little bit of money?" And I said, "Yeah." And then he kind of stopped. He pulled over to the side. He looked at me and he said, "Tommy, what could you do with that money you earned?" And I knew immediately what he meant. And we went to the garden store, bought a bunch of clay pots, put them back where they were. He'd already added some other ones back there so that my mother never really noticed the difference. And then again, nobody was the wiser. Now, I brought that story up because of one thing. Most of us live our lives in fairly familiar patterns. Most of us, in fact, it's been said, live our lives like soap operas, which is why soap operas are often so popular. And while maybe not so much for some of us now in our particularly enlightened state of being, but there are probably series that you watch because you want to see how the characters are going to live out their predictable patterns. They have established themselves one way or another. Whatever show you're watching, they have established themselves in familiar ways that you either identify with or that you'd identify against, but somehow those patterns resonate with you. And so we watch them. We vicariously enjoy watching people's stories. The thing about soap operas is that they're so predictable it can get frustrating. And you may have known people who've told the stories about how they might find a soap opera character out in public, the actual actress or actor, and just walk right up to them and go, "Why did you do that to her?" And they would say, "I'm an actor, excuse me, I'm not that person, that's just a character." But we get into it, right? We get into these things, into these characters, because they're so much like ourselves in many ways. But here's the interesting thing. The thing about us is we get to watch these characters, and even you can do this with suspense movies. We do it a lot. You can do it with sort of B-rated scary films, and you can do it with soap operas. You're watching, and you're going like, "Don't listen to him. You can't trust him. You do this every time," right? I mean, we can see this happening when we're watching them, because we are watching them. But then in our own lives, it seems much more complex, much more complicated. How hard it is for us to get out of our own stories, out of our own lives, the narratives we're living, and go, "You've done this every single time this happens. Don't you see this is about, you're going to do the same thing you did last time." I mean, it's hard for us to do that. It was Socrates, wasn't it, who said, "The unexamined life is not worth living"? Famous quote we often say. I think there's a little more to it than just that. I think the unexamined life isn't living, because we're simply living out of patterns, out of scripts and roles and emotional patterns that we've lived out of, that maybe we were raised with, that maybe we've grown up with, and we can see it if we look back at our family histories, how some of these things have repeated themselves. We can see it in our work lives. When we look at if you were able to step back from a staff scenario or from a work setting, and if you were able to step back and look at it like it was somebody had scripted that whole thing, you'd be able to go, don't do that. Don't you know what that's going to do if you don't go ahead and open up about? Don't you see what's going to happen? I mean, we could do that, right? But we can't do it when we're in it for some reason. It's hard. The unexamined work life is not very easy to live either. We don't always take advantage of that opportunity to step out of our lives enough to see and to question and to examine. One of the things that I like about, let me get back to this thought here, that I like about my uncle and what he did. I've mentioned this in here before. My uncle changed the pattern. Do you see how he did that? He was always doing that. Now, in good narrative studies, mythology, folklore, what we call that is we call that the trickster tale, essentially, because that's what a trickster does. A trickster comes into the setting and changes the pattern, messes with the pattern. Sometimes it's just out of, just can't help it. The trickster can't help it. But a lot of times it's very intentional. The only way sometimes to get people off the course they're going is to completely mess with things. And that's what my uncle often did. He often changed the pattern. My uncle grew up in a dysfunctional family, the same dysfunctional family my mother grew up in. And that pattern continued its way through into my mother's family. It was there for my grandmother's family. All those same little dysfunctional patterns, those same little self-destructive lifestyles, all those things played themselves out. But my uncle somehow was able to step aside from that. I'm not so sure he always did it consciously. I think sometimes he experimented with it subconsciously, and it worked. And so he continued to do it because it created a different consequence, a different result, often one that was much more satisfying. How much more satisfying for his nephew to suddenly be shocked and surprised that there wasn't a punishment, but instead an opportunity to learn. He changed the pattern. And I've said in here a lot of times, I think several times at least in this whole narrative series, is that, you know, when I've worked with kids in writing classes, I do this. It's kind of a cheater thing. It's an author's kind of cheat that we can do if you're a writer. You can take a familiar pattern, a familiar story, and if you change the setting and the characters, you can create essentially a new story. And children's writers do it all the time. Joseph Campbell, the mythologist, said basically all narratives are basically one narrative, the heroic quest. They all basically revolve around that struggle. The heroes struggle to define themselves, to return back to the community with that new awareness and empower the community as a consequence. The problem is, though, that even though you change the story, you technically don't really change the story. You've just changed the setting and the characters, and it looks like a new story. The only way to really change the story, I mean, we see this played out in personal lives all the time, right? In interpersonal lives. Well, you can see it at work, you can see it in interpersonal relationships. You get a new partner, but the same thing works itself out, the same kind of relationship before. You raise your children the way that you were raised. I mean, all these kinds of patterns. You can change the setting, you can change the scene, the characters, until you change what is actually what we call in literature and mythology the motif. You don't really change the story. It's just a different setting and character. So in most of the soap opera stories, the motif is this need to control, this need to establish balance, order. Relationships get all chaotic. Everything's centered around possession and what we have and what we don't have. Love is kind of decorative, even though it's there, because love is a desire, but it's not really the goal, right? I mean, just watch any soap opera. Love's not usually, well, we have a soap opera writer here. I mean, she came up after, and I forgot your name already. I'm sorry.
Pat Joyce.
Pat Joyce, that's her pen name. And you wrote for, not Days of Our Lives?
Days of Our Lives and Search for
That's right. She's going to come and correct me after all of this, after I've said all this stuff. She says, you don't even have a clue what you're talking about. But yes, it just came up. I just don't know how terrifying that is when people walk up here and say things like that to you, you know. People who actually know what they're talking about. But that's not really the goal. The goal is to sort of play out these patterns because it connects to people. That's how we live our own lives. But if you don't change the motif, you don't really change the story. You'd have a hard soap opera, honestly, if the motif was all about, let's see how many people we can be connected to. Let's see how many people we can love, no matter what it means, no matter how we have to do it. I mean, right? You might not watch those soap operas very long. It might be kind of sweet and kind of fun, but you need conflict. We need conflict. It kind of drives us in some ways. But that's, I think, what Jesus is saying here. I think that's what Jesus is saying when he says, you're tied down to the mundane. I'm in touch with what is beyond your familiar horizons. You live in terms of what you see and touch. I'm living on other terms. I told you you were missing God in all of this. You're at a dead end. If you won't believe who I say I am, you're at a dead end of what is possible, and you're missing God in your lives. I think what Jesus is saying here is that the motif that we find ourselves living by is often the thing that's holding us back. If the motif is about what we feel like we have to have, what ideal we feel like our narrative needs to live out, needs to conclude with, how perfect the relationship has to be, how perfect the job setting has to be, all of these things that we live out that are really centered around this motif of basically establishing balance and control. That motif will ultimately still not satisfy. It's going to continue to play itself out like soap operas do. If we change the motif, we can begin to change the stories we live. But what's the opposite motif of control? Letting go. And that is scary, right? That's kind of scary. Letting go of our opinions, letting go of our sense that things have to be a certain way, letting go of who we think are our enemies, letting go. That's a difficult motif to live by. And yet I think that is what Jesus is reminding us. What he was telling the disciples and the Pharisees back then is that the institution of Judaism had forgotten its initial covenant and had established control, which is what we do. We're human. And yet what Jesus was saying is that to let go of that is to discover where you already are. Another way to put it is one of my favorite writers that you know, a lot of you all like him as well, Jalaluddin Rumi. He wrote this wonderful poem. I want to just read it to you. I think it describes what I'm trying to say too. In the early morning hour, just before dawn, lover and beloved wake and take a drink of water. And remember, when Rumi speaks of the relationship of love, he's speaking of the spiritual relationship. He's speaking of the relationship to the holy, as much as he's speaking about what it means to let go and deeply be connected to another person. In the early morning hour, just before dawn, lover and beloved awake and take a drink of water. She asks, do you love me or yourself more? Now really, tell the absolute truth. He says, there's nothing left of me. I'm like a ruby held up to the sunrise. Is it still a stone or a world made of redness? It has no resistance to sunlight. And then Rumi says, this is how the poet Hallaj said, I am God, and was telling the truth. The ruby and the sunrise are one. Be courageous. Completely become hearing and ear, and wear this sun ruby as an earring. Don't think of getting off from work. Don't think of stopping the digging. Water is there. The well is in our midst. Submit to a practice. Your loyalty to that is a ring on the door. And this is the favorite phrase that he has in there. Keep knocking. The joy inside will eventually open a window and look out to see who's there. There's this great line in the story, Lord of the Rings, the second, I think it's the second or the third trilogy, part of the trilogy, and now I'm forgetting the Twin Towers, the Two Towers. Not the Twin Towers, the Two Towers. And there's this great line, Frodo and Samwise have been on their own now as they're trying to make their way towards Mordor to throw the ring in and to have it burned in the fire, the Ring of Power. And they've just gotten through this amazing battle where everything around them is destroyed. This great dragon from Sauron has almost captured him. He faces this dragon, and at the last minute, Samwise throws him to the ground, lets the dragon carry him off. And then he looks up at Samwise and says, I can't take this anymore. I can't do this. And Samwise says, have you ever thought of this? Have you ever thought, what sort of story have we fallen into? I think what a great line to ask ourselves from time to time. What sort of story have we fallen into? And is it the story that truly invites us to live deeply? Or is it a story that we haven't examined?